Well, thanks for being present, for attending the seminar, for inviting me to come back to Warsaw after 2 years of pandemic. It was not such an easy time. Also has some impact on the work you can do during the pandemic. What I'm presenting today is work with my former PhD student who started in the beginning of the pandemic, and this was our work. So Graccyela Salcedo, she is now at USP-São Carlos, and we studied contracting on average iterated function systems. So first I will talk about defining contracting on average and also certain concepts which are related, contraction on average, and other concepts in this context. Then I will mostly talk about iterated function systems on the circle, and at the end, if time permits, to talk something about limit laws and some stochastic properties which are consequences of those things. So the initial question was, if you have a system which is not, I found one reference in one phrase in a paper that studied contracting iterated function systems or weaker conditions of contractions and iterated function system. And the main theme, the main idea of this phrase was, if your system behaves in a way that every trajectory, or almost every trajectory, wanders sufficiently around to pick enough contraction somewhere in space, then you have already good properties. So this is a very weak phrase, but I like the phrase because it's kind of motivating. And in fact, it is also very present in many other contexts which you come across in dynamical system theory. So let me just recall some nowadays classical references which are somehow related to what we did. We take a system which is not quite contracting, change the metric, change the point of view, and show that in this new metric, the system has sufficiently nice contracting properties. And this is, for example, later on I will say a bit more important if you want to study stochastic properties of the system. So why is this? What are the classical results related to those findings? For example, it's classical for expansive, say, homeomorphisms, that you can change the metric to make it a uniformly expanding map. So this is, for example, Reed in 87, and there's a paper by Katrin, also from the 80s, 89, studied expansive homeomorphisms and showed that there is a change of metric that makes the system uniformly expanding on stable sets and uniformly contracting on unstable sets, and this helps to understand the topological structure of those expansive homeomorphisms. There's also for endomorphisms as a technique, is, for example, Felix in your book with Mariusz Urbański, he also discusses this technique. But changing the metric, well, it's well known that the hyperbolic structure, uniformly hyperbolic dynamical system, if you change you can, it does not depend on the metric. So you can change the metric, you still remain with the hyperbolic, uniformly hyperbolic diffeomorphism. This is, for example, in papers by Schub or Hirschspiel, in the book by Hirschspiel Schub. This also extends, for example, to dynamic systems which are not hyperbolic but have dominated splitting, that you can change, for example, conveniently the metric to get rid of some constants. And to change the metric is also classical in passing theory, when you want to analyze, if you have a hyperbolic measure of a C2 diffeomorphism, then in a large measure set of points, you can locally change the metric to describe and construct stable and unstable metrics. And this has, again, some version for dominated splitting, for example, by a paper by Abdenour, Bonatti, Corbusier in 2011. When they use the change of metric in a dominated context. Okay, so these are precursors of what we would like to do, or what motivated our work. So here we will look at. I will start by looking at a compact metric space and an iterated function system of many maps. And here I will assume that I have some homeomorphisms. And later on I will study the case of iterated function systems on a circle. And I will look fix a probability vector. So probability vector, meaning that its PDs are positive. I will consider non-trivial case. And then I will usually look at the triple of my iterated function system with this fixed probability vector and my metric in the metric space I look at. So you can call this an iterated function system with probabilities. Okay, and to start with some classical notations that when you have contraction, for example, in the paper, classical paper by Hutchinson from 81, then you assume that all maps, say, are Lipschitz, and these Lipschitz constants are less than 1. So lambda always, I will always look. You see lambda, and this will be a contraction constant. So contracting on average, which I just, there will be many abbreviations in my talk. I hope that I will discuss homeomorphisms.
Less than 1
or 3.
I thought it was compact. It's not compact.
It's not compact. Oh, okay, I'm not very consistent. Parts of the things we did in bigger generality, but for some reason, in some of my statements, I will so I will use many abbreviations. I hope that the abbreviations are chosen in a way to be easy to recognize. So contracting on average means that, well, relative to the probability vector, that the distance of your map in average contracts. And this should be true of points in your space. Then there is a slightly weaker concept, which is non-expansive on average. Which means the same thing, only that lambda is here equal to 1. So let me write down condition. And then I will perhaps wait a second moment. I will discuss, let me start with some weaker concepts because before entering the ones I would eventually use. There is a slightly more general context and concept than contracting on average, which appears in a paper by Lyapunov and Friedman, which uses the Lipschitz constants. So this is Lyapunov. It's a very nice survey from 1999, which of course implies contracting on average. Then there is a slightly weaker version by Peignier from 1930. Which says that instead of looking at the first iteration, you allow a concatenation of maps. Okay, so this should be less lambda. Okay, well, contracting on average implies this, but in fact, if you have this this property, you can pass to an iterate of your system and get a contracting on average. So this is like the iterate of your iterative function system is this property, and in fact, is already motivates the first choice of metric. So you can here change a metric which depends on k and lambda, the quantifiers, to get contracting on average. Okay, and that last I would like to mention, even though I'm not using this condition, which is, for example, it's not really contracting, but it's not in the spirit of non-expensive on average by Barnsley, Demko, Elton, and Geronimo in 88, which is also implied by contracting on average, and you can make a change of metric to imply contraction on average. Okay. Okay, so these are some contexts in the literature where people studied contraction condition or some more weaker versions. I will focus on the property of contraction average. And perhaps let me first give a motivation why this is important. And perhaps the reference, what I mentioned already, Barnsley, Demko, Elton, and Geronimo, they proved that if you have contraction on average, then there is a unique stationary measure. So a unique measure, probability measure, which is sometimes is also called an invariant measure. And Peignier studies a couple of weaker versions, but also obtains results assuming that so your system is contracting on average. So honestly, into
I think it's a topological question. Is it clear that there is some interesting limits for this? It's normally clear that there is
a priori
a priori
not.
possibility.
I mean,
contracting, then there is.
of course, the classical very much goes.
No, I understand because on the what is the support?
Yes, I mean, in general, you could
Support can be
works, yes. Well, Peignier in his in his paper 93, he obtains, assuming contraction on average, he obtains central limit theorem, and also well, strong law of large numbers, which is not surprising, but he obtains a central limit theorem for the Markov chain. So sometimes they are also called quenched central limit theorem. So for any x looking at the Markov chain induced by the k. So if you have the sequence C, so we'll get C in the sequence space and symbols. Then this would be defined by taking the concatenation of the first three symbols and apply this to x. Okay, so if you have contraction on average, you get some stochastic properties of your system and consequences of results about the stationary measure. And this was part of our motivation to look for conditions which guarantee contracting on average. In particular, if you look at, for example, the existing uniqueness of the stationary measure, perhaps its topological properties, that if you change the metric to an equivalent metric, it really doesn't impact. So a change of metric would give you some more flexibility. Okay. So, well, I won't focus on those. Let me get rid of those and discuss a few more properties which are related to those contracting conditions. As there are, for example, a synchronization property. I tried to work out how to do this on just one board. Let's see if this works. I will have three more conditions. A K eventually contracting on average. Then I will look at locally eventually contracting on average. And eventually strongly contracting on average. Okay, so okay, so what are other more topological conditions in this context? In particular, if we look at iterated function systems on the circle, there is synchronization. Which says that for every pair of points and almost every sequence, here we need some more notation. The following object, which depends on some iteration, the metric, the starting points, and C, and this is nothing but the distance of your images of your point X if you follow the Y, if you follow the first n iterations. You fix a path, a sequence, and you will take the first n iterations of this point, values to this point. And if you take 2 points, then you look at the distance of this function. So if the distance eventually, for any point in almost all trajectories, if the distance shrinks, the system synchronizes. And this is the definition of synchronization.
Almost every modes.
In the measure which is induced by so you take a Bernoulli distribution. This I won't discuss more general distributions. Well, probably you could do some of the things I would like to present, also analyze for Markov distributions or more general distributions, but some of the methods are limited. So beyond the Markov context, there is not so much done. Okay.
So I ask because a measure appears here, but this is downstairs, not in the symbols. So
Yes. No, this is the stationary measure on the base space, on the metric space.
here you have some
And here you have the symbolic space. Okay. So I will, the measure associated to the probability measure, I will call mu, which is the Bernoulli measure on the sequence space. Associated to this this probability vector. Okay. Some concept which is slightly more stronger is exponential synchronization, meaning that there exist constants lambda between 0 and 1, some positive constant c, such that for any pair of points and any n, your distance in your expected distance goes decays like this, and here the expectation. I put this here at that space. So the expected value is the integral and here you take the denominator. Okay, so of course this is stronger. Then you have a slightly more bigger condition, which is synchronization average, such that saying that for any point of pair of points in average, your distance decays to 0, and finally a property which is called proximality, which is again bigger, saying that for any pair of points there is some sequence and some sequence of times such that the distance of your points goes to 0. Okay, so this is all what I would like to discuss, and no more. I should find those. I'm sorry about this. Okay, so let me complete what is missing here. Those are those are more topological concepts. They don't require, besides this exponential synchronization, they don't have any specific decay rates a priori. So what else I want to define here? This is like the condition that was in the what I referenced to Pellier, that you look at some iteration of your iterated function system and require that this has this contracting on average property. So there is some k such that in average your distance is contracting. It's only k rate lambda, which is between 0 and 1. Okay, and then I introduce a local eventually contracting on average. Which says that for all pair of points, there exists some iterate, and I didn't say here there is not. Well, there's always a lambda, but here a priori may depend on the point, such that the contraction is in average contracting those 2 points. And then finally we have here the eventually strongly contracting average, saying that for every point there is some iterate and there is some neighborhood u of x such that an average your system contracts only for 2 points, but say 2 points C and W. If you take C and W, any pair of points in your neighborhood of X, it should be testing. Okay, so this is the context of my contracting conditions I would like to study. See if I have some more implications I would like to put this synchronizing on average implies the local eventually contracting on average property, but besides these properties, there is no a priori no implication. Well, of course, contracting on average implies non-expensive on average. Implies contracting on average implies this eventually contracting on average, but besides this, there are no further conditions. Okay, so okay, perhaps to give some reference, these are we weren't the first to introduce those conditions. I'm not sure that I so just to say something about the last two conditions, this LECA, this local eventually contracting on average. So I need to switch off the microphone here, or is, for example, in papers by Kaiser, by Stenflo, Carlson, Jarni, Tweedy, and Stenflo from Lagadas. So this is a condition which is studied quite a lot in the literature. And this last condition is in a work by Odi and Stenflo. In fact, why I got interested in those systems was originated in when I was staying for a semester in ICERM, and I met there Odi and Stenflo, and we started working on this iterated function systems on the circle. I will later on mention some result in this grew out of this collaboration. In ICERM, which is in Providence. So conference of the Brown University. Okay, so let me perhaps state the theorem and then try to discuss some examples and counterexamples. So basically, I would like to discuss first two theorems. Okay. It will be a proposition first. So theorem A would be the following: that if the triple of an iterated function system with a probability vector and some metric, assuming that I have an iterated function system of Lipschitz maps. I'm sorry, I said in the beginning I would like to consider homeomorphisms, but perhaps this was a bit too early, because some steps you need some extra properties, but yeah, this is not the point now to state the theorem. I definitely always want to have a compact metric space. I assume that the iterated function system is a system of Lipschitz maps, which has the property that it is not expensive on average, satisfies the local eventually contracting on average, and the eventually strongly contracting an average condition. Okay, then there is lambda and n such that the system with a metric which I will define in a minute is contracting an average, and yeah, so this is the first result. So d and lambda is scalar by the following formula. So once is given by the sum so with this new metric, you get a contracting average to function system.
Question, so having this n does imply that it will be also CA for larger n or for subsets of n? Look at the is it just one of them?
Good question. Don't know. Maybe yes. Let me perhaps I get back to your question in a moment.
So you ask a possibility of choosing that one n.
So if we have on one n, will it be true also for larger n? So
So
maybe for multiple sources.
Well, multiple
Okay,
for intermediate.
good for multiple, then the gaps between consider multiple bounded from that so small.
I see.
Because you have this. And the A assume it's so finite. Don't spoil you.
Okay, so
So we can about it here.
yes.
And the end
Te matrze chyba wszystko pod bounded.
options. That's enough. Assume it's then it's uniform options.
It's a matrix, compact matrix, and yes.
Is it compact or not compact? Do you assume compact matrix?
Yes, I assume compact matrix. In this theorem. In this theorem.
You still in the but you cannot when you have troubles with CA.
No, you don't the same thing.
You don't assume CA. No, but you prove CA.
Yes.
So you prove something which cannot be true for compact. No?
Why does it not be true?
No, it's not compact.
I never understood. Sorry.
The condition ESCA is weaker than the previous conditions. And then I don't understand your statement. Or
They
not.
are a priori unrelated.
They are purely unrelated.
Yes.
We compare and look at the second is weaker than the first, but it's okay.
We discussed some examples. They are a priori unrelated. You need to, and you need to.
You need both.
Yes. So before the second theorem will be in the context of circle maps. So perhaps let me first state a proposition towards the proof and then discuss some examples. Or perhaps, well, let's see that. No, yes, you're right. You're completely right. Let me put the here. Well, I tried to design the distribution, but it's not perfect to be independent of two cameras. But sorry, not that experience in hybrid. No, so okay. So the proposition towards the theorem is the following: that if your system is K eventually contracting on average, so eventually which refers to K, so you find some iterate K such that the iterate is contracting on average. Then with this metric, sorry, for some lambda, let's say, for some lambda, let me put this some lambda here. Then for this metric is the system is contracting on average with lambda 1. So hopefully you can write the proof there. So let me discuss some of it. And here we focus mainly on two examples on the circle. One is an irrational rotation. Suppose that this is chosen such that this makes a minimal left and irrational rotation and not more small diffeomorphism, which has an attracting and contracting fixed point. And why it's not contracting? Because of the presence of those points, and it's not contracting on average. Again, because of those expanding points. But you know, for example, that this proximal, it's synchronizing, has many good properties. So it does have some contraction eventually in your system. There's a, well, nowadays, perhaps one of the key references besides the work by Fürstenberg, by Baxenberg, by Cowell, is the paper by Malissé from 2017, who studies, in fact, in a much more broader setting of homeomorphisms on this circle, the topological properties, synchronization properties of those systems.
So what is satisfying?
So it is
Non-zero.
So this is, let me just write some properties, which is not non-expensive on average with this standard metric, because we have some propulsion there. It is synchronizing here, that almost every sequence synchronizes 2 points.
What is the probability of this?
The probability is always a nonlinear degenerate probability vector. So you get Bernoulli measure induced by this probability vector. Okay. So you have synchronization, which implies synchronization average, which, well, I didn't prove this, but you can show that this local eventually contracting average. Okay. Well, now he enters the work I did with Stanford, who kind of called my attention to those systems. When you look at the stationary measure for the inverse iterated function system, the iterated function system of the inverse maps, assuming that this is minimal, this is the general hypothesis here, it's clear because you have one iteration with irrational rotation, so it's minimal forward and backward. But a priori for any system of iterated circle diffeomorphisms, homeomorphisms could be more different. So here the system is forward and backward minimal. Then you take, you can find a metric, let's say call this rho, which is defined on base of this measure. So you take the minimum of those values, x and y are here, the intervals bounded by 2 points, and this defines a metric. And with this metric, the system is non-expensive on average. So you get the first idea of metric to make it, well, at least non-expensive on average. You get at least here, you do not get contraction, but at least non-expansion. Okay, so this was the first step, and in fact, at some point, asked, so is just a metric change to make it contracting, and this can be done, but this will be theorem B. So,
So is it related to Rosenberg theorem if you change it to maps as noticed at infinity for 2x2 matrices? We assume some transitivity, some Rosenberg assumption, and you obtain non-zero.
yes, of course. I mean, this in particular, this example
Like a version.
is a very specific case of result by everything. And in a sense, my sales approach is also an extension of this groups in two aspects. First, he looks at general groups. So he does not assume just the two n maps to concatenate freely, but a priori looks at any group of homeomorphisms. So Malice, Dominique Malice, 2018. Okay, so okay, so this is non-expensive on average. Okay, it satisfies this local eventually contracting because coming from the synchronization, but it doesn't satisfy the eventually strongly contracting on average with respect to this metric, because this metric comes from a stationary measure for the inverse system. So in fact, this metric in average is an isometry. So it's not contracting. So it's not. So, well, I thought that this example is perhaps not very elegant because this will apply to theorem B. Okay, sorry. But it's a first class of examples, which is well, simpler to introduce. So let me give a second example. One from the circle.
So it looks like far generalization of Rosenberg, because with topological exploration, not all just matrices.
Yes. I mean, again, Malise is much more general in two aspects. First, that you assumes groups, semi-groups, and second, homeomorphisms.
Yeah, correct.
Well, I later on will also give a reference, but I cannot. I mean, Anna Stunek has also worked with Sharek on iterated function systems, in particular also in the circle, assuming minimality. So the minimality is also an overall hypothesis which is usually put. A priori, for this work, we don't use minimality. So some of the approaches is just go somewhere beyond minimality or before minimality. Okay, so let me try to sketch the second example. It is also on the circle, assumes that there is some interval J and some interval I, such that here you have some expansion. Some more small map. And which is also expanding. It's okay. So that you have here an interval. So here I marked iterated function systems. So there are some hypotheses. First, there is an interval J here, which has so you require at any point which is not in J, eventually it maps into I, and I is some neighborhood of this contracting region, so I is forward invariant by the maps and contracting. So an interval where the two maps are contracting. Here this is for sequences. And further, you have the condition on here some subinterval J, such that the points in the subinterval by either of the two maps map outside J. So we call this J star. So by either of the maps, points in this subinterval J are mapped outside J. Okay, so this is an example of an iterated function system which is not minimal, neither forward nor backward. Well, it is in a sense eventually contracting because by hypothesis eventually you fall into that interval in contraction. But it is, if you put here the condition that this is expanding, then the system is expanding in some region, and hence it's not even non-expansive. Okay, so it is proximal. Because you have eventual contractions. It is, so let me perhaps need to. So it's proximal. And well, in fact, state the smaller properties is synchronizing and synchronizing on average. And has this local eventually contracting on average property. Okay. For that example, we introduce a metric which is defined as follows. It's the expected value of so this is in the spirit of this part is in the spirit of metrics which you use in investment theory, for example. And we show that this metric there is some alpha such that it is equivalent to the metric d to the power alpha. So they are they generate the equivalent metric, not strongly equivalent because it's alpha equivalent. And what else? And there is some calculation which I'm not going to present, but you can show that with respect to this U metric, the system is non-uniformly non-expensive on average. Still synchronizing and hence synchronizing on average, and hence has this local eventually conflicting average property, and it also has this other second. So with respect to this change metric, your system satisfies the hypothesis of theorem A, and this it is conflicting. So I'm not going to use those calculations to show a big thing. But it is an example which is beyond minimal, the minimal hypothesis. Okay, so let me give some, I don't know, I mean, perhaps to some of you this proposition is immediate, but perhaps I can write some proof and then give an idea of the proof of theorem A. So first, this metric, first I will copy this definition of the metric on the sport. Okay, so this expected value is a pseudometric first, and for any positive number, and you start counting on you also sum up the original metric d, so this gives you defensive metric. So and to show that the system is contracting on average, you need to verify that in your U metric you have convection. And I promise that this will be okay. Okay. And then you take the definition of this is to your measure, and then this is while you iterate the function system is in fact piecewise constant, so this is then you write down the definitions of the metric. And so on and so forth, up to 1 plus 1 k. Sorry. Yes. The next term, so this is
Katrin, sir, question. So the being you have here d of fi x fy y. So this should be for L equal to 1 in your formula for dk lambda, right?
0. So you get the first term, the original method.
But wouldn't be just d of x, right? Then
Let's say
in the formula
sorry,
for z.
I got no. I wanted to write the closed form, but then it's not. Sorry. Let me write this. So this is
K.
huh?
And it's K.
NSK.
K minus this or K is minus 1 is the numerator. Numerator.
Oh, I
Oh,
see.
it's nice.
The battery isn't taking on electrons, so I want okay.
It's correct. So, well, you need to show contracting on average, you need to apply your system and then calculate the distance. So this is this. And well, I'm not sure if I need to write the entire formula, but here you get the second terms. The last term will be contracting by hypothesis. And then you rewrite the definitions of metric and you get the contraction, which you separate 1 over lambda 1 over k, and you get the contraction with respect to reasoning. So, okay. So this is this proposition, and this is the main tool we look at. There are a few other metrics which we studied, but this is mainly this. So, any questions? Technical. Okay, so let me give an idea of the proof of the theorem. So you look at the product space of your metric space and fixing a point outside the diagonal by the condition okay, by a condition of local eventually contracting on average for any pair of points x and y. There is some iterate, which depends on x and y. And there is some lambda, which depends on x and y, such that the effective value is, well, compared. Okay, and well, you can fix here some neighborhoods, let's say W, V, such that this is here true, say with some, you have continuous maps, finite combination, sum of continuous maps, so this will be true with some smaller, some weaker contraction for any point set in W in this neighborhood. Okay. Can you take a point okay, when you take a point on the diagonal by the other condition, you get a contraction okay. And then in some neighborhood depends on the point. Well, you cover your space by some finitely many neighborhoods, and you get a family of constants Li and lambda I, which depend on those neighborhoods. To take the largest point. And you prove that in average for these iterations these are contracting on average. And now I can answer your question. There is some monotonicity in the iterations. Okay, so and hence your system is L eventually contracting an average, and then you change your metric according to the proposition. It is L and this number. And it is your system is okay. So this is the idea to prove the theorem. I need to combine these two contracting conditions to get contraction on average for those systems.
Question. So I didn't see if you used the non-expanse.
Right. I used, yes, sorry, I forgot to say this. I do use non-expensive on average. Oh,
Maybe to compare
so
the average of level L.
Yes, I guess, yes, exactly, exactly, here, this one, yes, here for this monotonicity. Thanks. Yes, so precisely. Okay. So this can be applied, now coming back to our examples, we had here this hypothesis satisfied, but for that metric where you do get non-expensive on average, you cannot by the theorem because this condition, but perhaps this is also not strictly necessary because the theorem is fairly general because it doesn't use the structure of a Lipschitz map on the circle. So let me state a second theorem, which is talks about a particular case of iterative function system on the circle. Okay, so this is theorem B. So assume that F is a system of C1 diffeomorphisms on the circle, and assume that proximality those concepts are partially only topological, so they do not a priori need a probability vector. And I assume that the system is proximal, and it does not preserve a common probability measure. So there is no measure which is simultaneously invariant by all maps of the iterative function system, which is the case here because the rotation just would preserve Lebesgue, but Lebesgue is not preserved by the Morse map. And take it on the degenerate probability vector. Well, and then the statement is that for any non-degenerate probability vector, there exists then for any probability vector, there exists some alpha and some lambda such that and some n such that the iterative function system with probabilities and d relative to the metric d, where d is the metric d to the power alpha, and then taking the metric obtained from that abstraction. So this is compact. Moreover, these two metrics to some constant equivalent in this way for some. So after a change of metric in this situation, you can get a system which is not taking on the system. So again, why is this? Why? What was our motivation? You have a system which is not contracting on average, and you get the stochastic properties for the system. You get a unique stationary measure. You get the quenched central limit theorem, the smaller large numbers, and I'm not sure if I have time to say something more about the tool.
So here, D is animated in the usual topology.
The original metric is the usual distance on the circle, the maximum.
So this is.
I'm sorry, yes, it's not a circle.
Yeah, so to these Euclidean.
D is here. D is the usual one. Okay. So perhaps I can.
Understand, you don't assume if you have anything about this.
I assume that is D1 diffeomorphisms. It's not proximal and does not preserve the common probability measure. With these two assumptions, the system is synchronizing. This is, for example, I mean, studied in Malissé and precursors of Malissé. So the synchronizing is in fact exponentially synchronizing. In fact,
You assume this assertion or you assume that? No?
yes,
No.
this is the assertion. Here's the end of the assertion. Sorry, the hypothesis. And then the assertion is for any probability vector, they exist constant.
Yeah, the same, but the question was what was the assumption? The system is proximal and synchronizing.
Proximal, and it does not preserve the common probability measure.
Which would imply.
These two properties imply. Yes, I wanted to discuss these relations, but perhaps this is not.
You obtain contraction average for every vector P.
Yes.
Which means probably alpha, if you have P almost concentrated at one point, alpha is close to
It will-
0.
Yes, for any
You obtain almost.
vector you get quantifiers.
So if you make it concentrated at one, you obtain almost contraction for every mapping.
Yes. Eventually, after some. Sorry, this is. If it is concentrated, then you means that you need to apply your system sufficiently long to eventually catch some contraction, which is there because of synchronization.
Yeah.
But-
So I didn't. Have assumption.
Perhaps I give some idea about the proof, because it also mentions some results by Malissé, and discuss some points. So Malissé,
If you remember, there was once course by Jackson, and the one that is seminar, and then he was proving exactly this, but proximal and no invariant matter and plus synchronization.
let's see. So it's like you have the over proximal and no invariant measure, no common invariant measure together imply a local contraction property, which I will state. I think it's interesting. And if you have this local contraction property, then proximal and synchronization are equivalent. And moreover, if you are in a minimal context like in the group by Anna and Shari, then if you have minimality and do not preserve, then this property that you do not preserve a common invariant probability measure implies that your system is a factor of it has a synchronizing factor. So it's either synchronizing or a finite couple of synchronizing. So these properties are all, it's like a triangle or are related among between each other. There's a strong relation between them. And so let me perhaps finish with some steps which you need to study in this group. So Malissé states first proves this local contraction property. So fix a probability vector P, then there is some lambda. Not sure if this doesn't, I think it depends. Such that for any x, and almost every sequence, there is some neighborhood of x, some interval, such that if you iterate this interval, its length will be shrunk by this factor. And in fact, the shrinking factor doesn't depend on the point, but the neighborhood depends on the point. Okay, so it's some local convection property, which is one of the steps. And so if you look at now to get this on average property, you look at the following quantifier. You look at the exponential shrinking rate. Okay. This is integrated. Okay, so this is a sub-additive function. So if you take the limit, then the average, this converges, and this converges to some value a, which is less or equal than log lambda by the slope of contraction property. What is you need to show that it converges by some additivity, but converges to some value which is less or equal than lambda by which follows from this contraction property. And and then there's some more calculation to do that to prove that there is some alpha. This is the assertion such that your system d to the power alpha is okay eventually calculating an average with the real. And then you conclude with the theorem A that with this lambda is converging. So these are some steps which use, of course, work by say to conclude. Okay, so let me perhaps finish with some comments, which I will almost stop here. In Malisse's work, he looks at these local contraction rates, and also he has some results on synchronization. He says that it's exponentially synchronizing, but in fact you can prove that it's in average synchronizing with the same rate. So kind of in average you have a uniform rate of synchronization. In this case of so-called diffeomorphisms. And in some work which is still ongoing, we look at these synchronization rates and some large deviation results about these synchronization rates, and of course, as Felix also mentioned, you have a negative Lyapunov exponent. You see contraction, so you get Lyapunov exponent and at the large deviation of the expected Lyapunov exponent. So having at hand the contraction on average, which implies that you have a probabilistic result like the central limit theorem, strong law of large numbers, the law of iterated functions, the law of iterated logarithm. You can also conclude some further properties about large deviation results on your expected numbers. So this is an application of those results. But I think
We have questions.
What is the smoothness you think your smoothness is one from all this? Because the concepts results are from your mouth. So someone
yes. There was yes. so I don't quite remember. I think in
But
the,
it is a sentence.
no,
It's a sentence.
yes, I think you use this to conclude the contraction because you have Malise proofs that you have contraction of the interval, but here you have the distances. So you like to conclude about distances. So I remember what it means. So some technical step too. Perhaps can be removed, but to get this transaction.
Just give some distortion estimation.
Using by C1.
This gives some.
C1
But it's exponentially fast.
Yes.
That's C1, it's not C1. Maybe if I can one comment. This statement that why we have this dichotomy between the existence of invariant measure and the situation where that everything is stochastically contracting, it came from concavity. This the map of the circle goes to the circle with its length. So the integral of the derivative is on average 1. But this means that the integral of the logarithm of the derivative is in general non-positive. It can be equal to 0 in this situation when there is some measure preserved, and otherwise it is strictly negative contraction.
Was it use it?
Yes. Well, yes, this is the fine, sir.
Very slow.
So
Okay, I would do it for a long.
Malise is, I mean, to this, he continues from of Carl and well, also of Fürstenberg, but he puts the this idea that you have a dichotomy of either isometric dynamics versus local contraction in this context we studied of homeomorphisms and it's a bit in the spirit of Powell and also Adler and Viana when they derived the what was the term? What do they call this principle? Invariance principle. So either you have isometries which preserve a common invariant measure, and if you do not have this in your fraction or negative grammar, it's if you put some regularity in. And in fact, he proves he uses some of those results that go back to Letrapier, Carl, Adler. The idea was to prove the invariance principle.
I have a question. In the context of theorem B, you say reliable assumption C1 for homeomorphism, which is homeomorphism. Then can you obtain a similar assumption, but so something maybe not equivalent metrics are it's not strongly equivalent by but relating the same topology?
Should know. I should know, but I forgot this point, sorry. In some ongoing work, we try to assume only the non-existence of an invariant measure. And instead of minimality, we assume that there's a priori a unique stationary measure, homeomorphisms on the circle, and conclude that this system is exponentially synchronizing average.
So minimal.
Sorry, synchronizing average. Synchronizing on average on an exponential speed. So Well, either you use minimality and this assumption, minimality and this assumption, or that there does not exist a unique, that there is a unique stationary measure. So there are some generalizations for homomorphisms. In fact, they were inspired by some group by Shai, with a student, a former student. So yes, but this is ongoing.
Questions? No, so let's time this compared again. And good old times you are invited for tea or coffee